usually say a couple of nice things about our student so that everyone knows how wonderful they are. And then we allow them to present. Generally, it's going to be a 35 to 40-minute presentation. Then we take questions from the committee, take questions from the public. So Emily and Billy, I want you to come up with some good questions. Then the committee itself kind of excuses itself for about 5 to 10 minutes to kind of discuss the quality of the work and if it has kind of met the standards required for a master's thesis. And then we come back in and kind of discuss it. So that's kind of generally how the process works. So it is a formal presentation, so if you could just wait until Nicole gets through all her materials. And then afterwards we have our question and answer session. That would be great. All right. So before I turn the floor over to Nicole, I just wanted to talk about her for a little bit. So Nicole actually began our program in the fall of 2012. Mm-hmm. So has it felt like 4 years?
Yes, and I've been both part-time and full-time. So I went back and forth. I started part-time, then I went back to full-time, and then I went back to part-time, and now I'm back to full-time.
So actually Nicole has made steady progress during her whole time here. She's worked with many different faculty members, and I don't know if you know this, I actually went into your folder to look back at your application materials. I was like, ooh, what do we remember? What can we uncover from Nicole's past? And she came to us with an undergraduate degree in English and journalism. So anyone who's ever worked with Nicole knows that this woman can write prolifically and write well. So that was really a great skill set that she brought into our program. And I don't know if you all also know that she worked with an assembly member in the 6th District on a bill to increase funding for California's oil spill prevention. Mm-hmm. So she already came to us with a tremendous skill set in communication and a passion for environmental issues, and I think she just used the master's program as a way to really gain expertise in a topic that she felt really passionate about. And I saw, threaded throughout your professional work before you came to our department was this love of and interest in marine issues. And so I was so glad to see that you kind of continued that because as we all know, our oceans are so threatened and so endangered, and this is one of the biggest pieces of recent legislation that we've had over the past couple decades that can really solidify support for marine areas. And as Nicole has learned, and as we all know, getting a bunch of disparate stakeholders to agree on anything when we're talking about marine areas is incredibly challenging. So I think she did an amazing job with the work that she's going to talk to us about. Nicole, as you mentioned, has also been working part-time as a staff member for LSA Associates, where Greta works also. So Greta, we really want to say thank you for participating on Nicole's committee. And she's been doing tons of really high-level professional work, CEQA, NEPA, documentation. She's been working on residential projects, bicycle pedestrian projects, transportation projects. So she's really kind of had such a wide range of experiences here. 3 things about Nicole that I think are worth noting. She has a constant thirst for knowledge. So I think Alex probably appreciated this as well, and Greta. Like whenever I'd say, why don't you go look into whatever? And then she'd like go dive into it, and a month later she'd find like 500 sources on that topic. So that's something that I really appreciated, that she never, she knows so much about public participation and MPAs. I don't know anybody who knows more about that subject than Nicole. And as I mentioned, she's an amazing writer. She has such a way with words, and working with students who sometimes struggle for their voice, I think it's just such a breath of fresh air to work with somebody like Nicole when you say, could you write something about blah blah blah? And she's like, oh my gosh, yes. And it comes out and it sounds amazing. And she's also a very kind and caring person, and I think that really comes through in her writing and just things that she does every single day. So I just feel so fortunate to have been able to work with her. She's a great researcher. She's a wonderful new voice in the environmental field, and she's an amazing person. So,
all right. Nicole. Thank you so much, Catherine.
Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Nicole.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming. The title of my thesis defense is called A Case Study, An Analysis of the Marine Life Protection Act, the Collaborative Planning Process on the South Coast region of California. What I'd like to first do is give a quick thank you to my thesis committee for their time and their support they've given me for this project. So My committee includes Dr. Catherine Cushing, Dr. Alice Gershenson, and Dr. Greta Brownlow, who are all here today, so thank you very much for coming. Before I begin my presentation, I'd like to talk about the topics that I plan to discuss today. So I'm going to start with an introduction. So it'll be a background, an introduction to what MPAs are and how they do them here in California. And then I'll discuss the related research that was used to inform my research project. And that will include both the MPA literature as well as the public participation literature. I'll then move into research methods, which will focus on my research questions, as well as my data collection and how I analyze the data. And then I'll present my findings and my results, which I think is the better part of this presentation. And then in conclusion, I'll have a discussion and recommendations and hopefully some time for Q&A. So I'd like to start out with is what a definition of what a marine protected area is, and they're also known as MPAs for short. But I included two definitions here. One is from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the other one is from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And I included both of these for two reasons. One is because California is the topic, or the topic of my research, and I included the International Union for Conservation of Nature, their definition, because they do protected planning all around the world, both terrestrial and in the marine environment, and they're also well cited in the literature. So some common names that you might have heard marine protected areas called are marine park, marine sanctuary, marine reserve, and marine refuge. And I'll give you my version, or a shorter version of what a marine protected area is. So basically it's an area in the marine environment that is set aside for protection, usually from human activities such as fishing. And the idea behind that is if you remove human activities like fishing, it allows the marine life to grow into their adult forms so that it can enhance the ability to reproduce. So I included this example here to show you what MPAs look like on a map. And I chose this example because there's a local example in the Bay Area, but it includes the three common types of marine protected areas that we have here in California. And if you notice, they're color-coded, so we have red, blue, and yellow. And the red is the strictest form of marine protected area, which means that you can't fish at all. So there's no commercial extraction or recreational extraction. And an example of that is the Montara State Marine Reserve down here in the southern region. The blue refers to a state marine conservation area, and that's actually considered a multi-use, limited-take marine protected area, so that does allow some limited commercial and some limited recreational fishing. And then the yellow is called a state marine park, and that actually prohibits all commercial fishing. So you can do some limited recreational, but no commercial fishing whatsoever. I also included some signage, and our example of a signage, so the bottom example, it says marine protected area, and you see a sign that says no fishing and no collecting. So this is typical of what you might see if you're out on the coast and you stumble upon a marine protected area, so that's how you would know if you're near one or not. I'm showing this example because this is a network of MPAs, so there's been a movement in the last decade or so to scale up individual MPAs into network of MPAs. And this example is the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, which is in the southern region. And what you see is more than one MPA that are connected spatially, and they are of different sizes, and they also offer different levels of protection. But in this example, they're specifically state marine reserves, so no fishing is allowed in any of these. And the reason why they do a network approach is because it can cover a lot more habitat than an individual MPA can do alone. And the idea behind that is that it can protect different species throughout their entire life cycle instead of at a certain time of their life, such as like a spawning ground. So this leads me to California and the topic of my study, which is the South Coast region of California, which I put in this box here. But I'll give you some background information on what the MLPA was. So the Marine Life Protection Act, which is known as the MLPA, was passed in 1999, and the idea was to reevaluate the existing MPAs that we had here in California along the coast and basically create a new network, a network of MPAs that are better connected and better managed and would produce better results. And to do that, they had a planning process throughout the state that was divided into 5 different regions. They started in the Central Coast, then they had a North Central Coast process, process on the North Coast and then also in the South Coast. And the process was a public planning process that involved bringing stakeholders together from the different factions that are affected, such as fishing, commercial fishing, recreational. Some tribal entities were involved, government, municipalities, counties, etc. And each region had their own planning process. So the focus of my study is the South Coast region. And I chose it for a few reasons. There were other theses that did come out in the other areas, so such as the North Coast, North Central Coast. There were theses that already came out on those planning areas. So there wasn't one in the South Coast. In addition, the South Coast actually is an interesting place to do this type of study because it actually is a highly populated area. There's lots of recreation going on. There's also the influence of the federal government with the U.S. Navy that has operations down there. There's also several islands, as you see, including the Channel Islands, but there's also additional islands that are off the coast. It also borders with Mexico. And the other thing about the southern region that's really interesting is it's what is called the Southern California Bight, which is an area of high productivity for the marine environment because you have the mixing of the different currents coming from the north, which is cold, and then the south, which is warm. So it's an area of high productivity, which also makes it really popular for fishing. So I wanted to give some background on NPA planning. So what I learned from the literature was that the success of an MPA depends on these elements. So the MPA design, so it depends on the size, it depends on the level of protection that it's given. It also depends on the management and if there's enough staff and resources dedicated to the management of them. Enforcement is also a big issue because you need staff and money to enforce it. There's both inadvertent fishing that happens or poaching because people don't know about it or they're not aware of it. And then there's also, if there's opposition, you'll end up with poaching. So what I wanted to emphasize on this slide, which I thought was really neat that came out in the literature, was stakeholder support and ongoing stakeholder support is actually really critical to the success of MPAs. And there's many reasons for this, but the main reason is because you want voluntary compliance. And the reason why you want voluntary compliance is because a lot of these public agencies don't have the money or the resources to do enforcement. So the idea is if you get the stakeholders on board and they support it, they will most likely voluntarily comply with the regulations of the MPA. In addition, specifically in NPA planning, the reason why they also want stakeholder support is because stakeholders do have a lot of local knowledge, especially fishermen, about areas of high productivity, and those are the areas that public agencies actually would like to protect. And lots of the times the science can't identify those areas as well as some of the local fishermen can. And so what they hope to do is work with fishermen so they get that information to make those areas protected. And finally, financial resources is also needed. If there's not a lot of financial resources, then you can't do the management or the enforcement or the participation process. So I also wanted to give you some background on public participation because this was also important to my study. And there's many reasons why we do it, but these were the main tenets that came out in terms of why we do it. And we do it because it legitimizes the planning process. It leads to greater support for a decision. And the idea is if you involve the public, it will result in more satisfying results for everyone. It also can result in higher quality outcomes. And that's also true because the idea is if you integrate local preferences and local values as well as the local knowledge, you'll end up getting a plan that is more satisfying and tailored to the specific stakeholder group in that area. Public participation is also done to reduce conflicts and also to build capacity so that the public is better equipped to participate in future planning processes. So I'd like to introduce my conceptual framework. So I don't know if you're all familiar with the National Research Council, but I used a framework that was developed by them, specifically Dietz and Stern. And the National Research Council is a research arm of the National Academies of Sciences, and what they do is they produce research for both the federal and state government agencies. And they created a panel called Public Participation and Environmental Decision Making. And what they did with that panel was create research about what makes a public participation process successful, or what are the outcomes, or how do you know it's a success. And what they came up with are these three boxes that I have here, which is legitimacy of the process, quality of the plan, and capacity building. And if all those are present, you'll usually end up with a successful participatory process. And I'll discuss briefly each one. So legitimacy of the process is more about, was the process fair and was it competent? And fair can mean a lot of things. So what I did was I went into the literature actually to find out what legitimate processes look like. And I have this handout. You guys are welcome to look at it. But it shows the criteria of what legitimate process is, and then what a quality plan would look like, and then capacity building. And so some examples that you might see is, was the process open and transparent? Was there an ability for participants to have influence? Did they have access to tools and information? Was everything clear, what they were asked to do? And in terms of competency refers to was a decision making grounded in science and grounded in sound decision making. And in terms of the quality of the plan, that also refers to the degree that the stakeholder stakeholder preferences were incorporated into the plan. And capacity building refers to whether or not the stakeholder group became better informed about the issue. And the idea here is if they become better informed about the issue, they'll be more interested in coming up with solutions for the problem. In addition, capacity building refers to the degree in which there's trust also between the public agency and also the stakeholders. So this is some of the related research that I used to inform my studies, and one of the things that you'll see both in California and MPAs that were also done elsewhere is that it's actually very common to have opposition among fishermen. So that was one thing that I did find. There's a lot of opposition and dissatisfaction, and in most cases you end up with problems such as poaching. And there's been some cases, including the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, where they did involve the commercial fishermen, and even though they opposed it, they did get, in some ways, what they wanted, but it was a reduced level of protection in terms of the MPAs that they were able to create. Now, the public participation literature is actually a lot more positive. So a lot of the research that I found there indicated that in most cases, public participation actually does work well in terms of reducing conflict, but it also increases the quality of the plan and the decision by creating joint gains. So I thought that was really interesting stuff. So I'll move into my research questions. So I had 3 basic research questions. I wanted to find out what was the role of the stakeholder in the South Coast regional planning process. I also wanted to find out how did stakeholders perceive the legitimacy of the process, and how did stakeholders perceive the quality of the final plan. So for data collection, the method that I used for my research study was a case study approach using 3 different data sources. The 3 different data sources that I used for my study was a questionnaire, which included a total of 24 questions. And those questions were Likert scaled, closed-ended, so the scale was from 1 to 5, 1 being the lowest, 5 the highest. And the questions that I used for both the interviews and the question were all grounded in the indicators that I just handed out. And then I also did semi-structured interviews, which included a total of 18 questions, and they were both open and closed. And then I also did document review to better understand the process and also to verify the information that I did obtain from both the questionnaire and the interviews. And this whole process of using 3 different data sources is called triangulation or data triangulation. And the idea behind that is to add credibility and verify the information that you have. So you might be curious about how I found the participants for my study. So one of the great things about government projects is that all the information is available online. And so the MLPA, all the documents are still available even though the process occurred 8 years ago. So I started with a participant list. And so my stakeholder group had 64 participants total. So I had a list of 64. And what I did was I started outreach in spring of last year. It maybe took about like a month or a month and a half to actually start lining up the interviews. But it was really hard actually because the list was 8 years old, so a lot of the people have either moved on, they got married, or they died, or they moved out of the area completely. So it was really hard for me to find some of these people to talk to. And so as you can see from this slide, I ended up with 23 participants total that were willing to meet with me in person. And I broke them down into different stakeholder groups. So it's commercial fishing, recreational, environmental, government agencies, academia, and I put a group called recreational non-fishing. See, these are the folks that recreate, so maybe scuba divers, kayakers, surfers, bird watchers. They have an interest, but not the same interest as like a fisherman might have. And all these stakeholders were located in the southern region, obviously. So I actually traveled when I did my field research to Santa Barbara, Ventura, Los Angeles, Orange County, and San Diego. I had a few meetings that actually were in Sacramento too. And one of the things I want to point out about this is it was actually challenging to meet with some of these people, especially the fishermen, because they expressed to me that they weren't interested in talking to me because they had such a negative experience with the planning process, and the consequences were so negative for them that they just didn't want to spend any more time talking about it with me. So they were fairly blunt. But on the bright side, I did get some folks that were willing to talk to me, and then when I actually had the interviews in real time, I was able to do this thing called snowballing, or by referral. So I was referred to a lot of people during the interview. So while I was down there, I was able to make other interviews happen in real time. So in terms of the analysis of my data, I obviously had two different data sources that need two different levels of analysis. So I used descriptive statistics for my survey data, and what I did was I analyzed the responses by the group as a whole. So I wanted to see how the group was responding as a whole to these indicators. And then I also divided the group into 3 different stakeholder groups. Or buckets, if you want to call them. So I grouped them into fishing, environmental, NGO, and government. And what I did was, with the descriptive statistics, I wanted to see how the responses were trending based on what type of user group they were. In terms of the interview data, so I did interview transcription. So I had 23 interviews total by the time that I was done with my field research. It took 2 months to actually do the transcription, and just so you know, each transcript takes about 5 to 12 hours, depending on how much time you have. So it took me 2 hours just to do the transcription. When I was done with the transcription process, or it took me 2 months, I'm sorry. So when I was done with the transcription process, I did a process called coding. So I used both deductive and inductive coding. And for those of you who don't know what that is, deductive is where you start with codes that are already predetermined. And I did that because I had certain things that I was looking for, and those are all in the indicators. So all my questions were based on those, and I had specific things that I was looking for. But then the inductive coding is where you code for things that emerge. So a lot of times when you have these dynamic interviews that are going on, you'll see trends in comments that keep repeating themselves throughout the interviews. And so what I did was I coded for those, and that was called inductive coding. So now I'll start moving into some of my results. And if you remember, the first question that I had was, what was the role of the stakeholder? And so here you see a map of the Southern California region, which is the planning area that they were responsible for. So what I found out from both document review and through the interviews was that they were tasked to actually reevaluate this map, look at every single MPA, and figure out which ones they wanted to eliminate, make bigger, move to another location, or add new ones. And there was an exception. So if you notice the Channel Islands, which are up here in the northern part, they're big in red, and they were not allowed to touch those because those actually happen through a separate process called the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary process. So they happened before the MLPA. So those were off limits. So they basically had to review the existing MPAs along the coast and create new ones. And to do that, they had to use specific guidelines that were given to them because the process was stakeholder-driven and science-based. So there was a strong mandate for science. So they had a science team that gave them specific guidelines in terms of what size they needed to be, what type of habitat they had to protect, and what the spacing had to be. But when they actually convened, they convened over the course of a year, they actually had to negotiate amongst themselves about those locations. So this is a table that kind of shows you some of the example criteria they had to work with. And what I did was I created a handout in case you want to see. And there was a lot more criteria than this. So you're just getting a glimpse of what they had to work with. They actually had criteria that was given to them by California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They also had criteria that was given to them from the Department of Parks and Recreation. And they had to work within guidelines that were given to them by the MLPA itself. The one thing that I wanted to point out about this is the science guidelines became a source of conflict for a lot of the stakeholders, and especially the requirement around the size. And if you notice, it says ideally the size of the MPAs should be between 3 and 6 miles long along the coast. So they had to draw them along a longshore span of 3 to 6 miles. Ideally, what they wanted was MPAs to cover between 6 and 12.5 miles of the coast. But if you're familiar with the southern region, there's a lot of beaches that a lot of people recreate at. And I'll just give you an example of one of the conflicts. So Laguna Beach in Orange County, the beach itself is almost 7 miles long. What they ended up doing was creating an MPA that was 6 miles, which is great for the marine environment, but it actually became a sore point for a lot of local fishermen or recreational fishermen who like to do that on a Sunday. And so it became a sore point for a lot of people because you are taking away access from something that they had before. And then I want to talk to you a little bit more about the process and how it actually works. And this is another, actually showed up clear on here, but I have handouts too. So this is like a shortened version of how the process unfolded. But I wanted to point out the key players and how the information flowed. So the stakeholder group that I had there were 64 of them, and it's this group here in the middle. Okay, so this is the regional stakeholder group, and they were tasked to create a draft NPA plan, and it was an iterative process. So they had 3 rounds over a course of a year. They started out, let me discuss how they were separated. So they were separated into 3 groups. So 64 total, they're separated into 3 groups. One group included mostly fishing interests, and then another group included environmental interests, and then there was a middle of the road group, which was a group of people who indicated that they were willing to compromise and they were willing to negotiate. And it was a group that wasn't necessarily on one extreme or the other. So the 3 groups would meet over a course of a year, and they would have to negotiate different map proposals. And what happened was every time they came up with a proposal, they would have to send it to the California Department of Fish and Game, the Science Advisory Team, and the Blue Ribbon Task Force for review. So let me point out who they are. So the Blue Ribbon Task Force was a task force of 5 to 6 individuals who were appointed by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they were there to give policy guidance and also to oversee the work of the regional stakeholder group and the proposals they were doing. The Blue Ribbon Task Force had to make sure that their plans met the requirements of the scientific advisory team, and they also had to meet the requirements that the Fish and Game had, and also Parks and Rec. So they oversaw the work of the stakeholder group, and then through an iterative process during those 3 rounds, they went back and forth. After the end of the 3rd round, the Blue Ribbon Task Force had to actually choose one map. They ended up with 3 in the end, but they had to choose one map to recommend to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife Commission, and the commission would adopt that plan and use it for CEQA in a later process. But essentially what happened in this process, the Blue Ribbon Task Force picked and chose from the 3 different maps to create this one map, and that one map was they used the one from the middle of the road group to form the basis, and then chose from the other 2 different elements to make this one map. And that actually caused a lot of problems, which I'll go into later, for a lot of the stakeholders. But the idea of this was to kind of show you how the different players worked with each other and who was responsible for what and how the process kind of unfolded. So during my interviews, I wanted to find out whether the role was clear to the stakeholders or if there was any confusion about why they were there. And what I found out was the stakeholder role was made clear to them. So about 74% of the participants indicated that they were there to make marine protected areas. So there's no confusion about that. But I included two other perspectives that I thought were interesting, and these came from the fishing communities mostly. One was that their expectation was they wanted to provide a balance of perspective and local knowledge, and the other was to make recommendations on a law. And I actually thought this one was an interesting comment because I think it really reflects the top-down nature of the MLPA, because it really wasn't bottom-up in this case, because it was a law and they were there to negotiate location of MPAs based on a law that was given to them. And then I wanted to find out, well, why did these participants want to participate in the MLPA planning process? Like, what was motivating them? And what I found out from the interviews was that there were 4 different categories. So there were some that were interested in conservation only, which was primarily the environmental community. There was another group that indicated that they were only interested in mitigating the social economic impacts, which came from the fishing community. And then there was a handful of participants that saw the value of both conservation and continued utilization of the marine resource. And then there was another group that actually had no interest in utilization or conservation, but these were mostly government entities. So for instance, the U.S. Navy, they were there because they wanted to protect the interests of the U.S. Navy. They wanted to make sure, because they operate on islands that are down there in San Clemente, and they want to make sure to continue to do what they do given that these MPAs are coming in place. The same thing with the Coastal Commission. The Coastal Commission was also a participant, not because they felt one way or the other, but they had to make sure that the final MPA plan that is developed considers the tenets of the Coastal Act. So I included some example quotes to show you what some of those comments were in terms of how I grouped them into whether they were only interested in conservation or they were only interested in social economic impacts. I'll give you a few minutes if you want to read through them. But the first one kind of illustrates from a conservationist perspective, we were working to get the most conservation-oriented MPA network that we could. And then if you talk to a fisherman, the response might be somewhat different, where they say, my expectation was to represent my constituency and to mitigate excessive closures from the social economic standpoint. And I thought this content was really interesting because it kind of shows why this process actually had a lot of conflict. And one of the emergent themes that came out of my research on the stakeholder role was that their perceptions about their role was actually limited. They felt their role was limited. So many of the comments that I got through the interviews suggested that they were constricted because of the criteria that was given to them, the science guidelines that I showed you earlier. And they felt they didn't have a lot of flexibility. So the location of the MPAs often were in places that were ideal for fishing because of the high productivity. And the locations of MPAs to meet the science requirements were often in the areas where there is fishing taking place. So they didn't feel like there was much flexibility there to meet the science guidelines, but to reduce any of the social economic impacts. And then there was a handful that said that, again, they were only there to make recommendations. So they didn't really feel that they had much decision making. And these are some of the example or comments that came out of the interviews to illustrate. So for instance, this commercial fisherman, he says the opportunity to come up with solutions was very limited based on the guidelines that was given by the scientific advisory team. And this was a very common theme that showed up in my interviews. And similarly with the recommendations, I don't think that I made any decisions. I made recommendations, no decisions were made by stakeholders. So it kind of shows you the level of influence that they might have had. So I'll move into the topic of legitimacy of the process. So I'm only going to highlight a few of the results because I had a lot of indicators. I couldn't put them all in this presentation, but we're going to look at a few. And the few that I chose were the ones that I thought were the most interesting that came out of my project. So decision making was an interesting one because when I did the descriptive statistics, I found out that about almost 60% disagreed with how decisions were being made during the process. And what I wanted to do was dig further into, well, which stakeholders were not happy with the decision making. So I broke it down into stakeholder groups, so fishing, environmental NGO, government institutional. And what I found out was there were sources of discontent with the decision making in all groups, which is this red bar here, shows disagreement. The fishermen, for the most part, disagreed with the decision making, but there was some discontent both in the environmental group and also in the government institutional group. And this was actually a little bit different than the results that I've seen on the other indicators. But yeah, and there were different reasons for why there was sources of discontent, and I'll quickly go through those. So one was this concept of horse trading. Many of the stakeholders felt that when they actually got into the negotiation room to actually negotiate, there were some decisions that were made in advance by other stakeholders. So for instance, I heard that an environmental group would convene with a commercial fisherman group outside of the process, and they'd make a decision or a deal based on, hypothetically, if you don't turn this into a reserve so we continue to fish, I will support you in closing this area. But this other area is actually important to some other fishermen who might be a recreational fisherman. So a lot of the stakeholders were disappointed because of these deals that were being made they had no control over by the time they got to the negotiation table. And that was actually true for a lot of the folks in which it was their first time participating in a planning process. They thought they were kind of naive because they felt they were going in there with good faith effort, and then what they found out was there was a lot of these backroom deals that were being made that undermined anything that they could do. Another source of discontent with the decision making was a sense of lack of consensus. It was supposed to be a consensus-based process, but what they ended up doing was reverting to majority votes, and that created problems for a lot of stakeholders for a couple of reasons. So the environmental NGOs felt that the fishermen were overrepresented, and there was a reason why they were overrepresented because there was different factions of fishing. So you have, on the recreational side, you have spear fishermen, you have kayak fishermen, you have free divers who fish, and then you have the hook and line surf fishermen folks. And then, on the commercial side, you have probably less variation in that type of fishing, but then the environmental NGOs, there were probably less than 10 that participated, but there's not as many of them. So they felt when there were votes, the votes actually favored the interests of the fishing group. So they weren't really happy with those results. And then in terms of the fishermen's perspective, they thought every time a vote ended in something that favored them, that the process would just start all over and say, oh, it doesn't count, we gotta do something different because it didn't make the environmental groups happy. And then another thing on the voting is that at the end of the process, there was a third and final vote on which plan to recommend for adoption. And what I learned through the interviews was that the recreational fishermen actually left. So when the final vote happened, the vote only reflected the people that were there, which were mostly government, institutional folks, and environmental groups. And a third source of discontent for decision making was actually the Blue Ribbon Task Force. So as I told you earlier, the Blue Ribbon Task Force was in charge of making the final decision on which map to choose, and they drew elements from 2 other maps. And that actually created a lot of problems for stakeholders because they felt they worked really hard in a negotiated process, and they made some significant compromises and it was a very stressful process for them. And so for them to do that over a course of a year, and then in the end to have the Blue Ribbon Task Force say, oh, we're just gonna pick from here and pick from here, it really made them feel like it was an arbitrary process. So those are the 3 sources of discontent in terms of decision making. And here are some of the example quotes that I gathered that pointed me in that direction of what those sources of discontent were. This first one kind of illustrates, no, it never reached consensus. It almost seemed like it was designed not to reach consensus. The second table here kind of shows how they were displeased with how the Blue Ribbon Task Force made decisions, because they thought they were political in nature, because they think if they really wanted to meet the scientific guidelines, something else would have happened, and that other things didn't happen, so therefore they concluded those decisions were political. And then here's this concept of picking and choosing from different plans, and this person was obviously upset. It says you can't pick and cherry pick from a compromise plan that people have spent a year and a half developing. Yeah, so they were upset. And then there's a fact of decision rules that kept changing. So the fishermen felt that the process actually changed the rules a lot of the time to get outcomes that favored more of the conservation-minded people. So another indicator that I looked at for legitimacy of the process was the level of influence. And I didn't include the neutral category, but I had agreement, disagreement, and neutral. And from the survey, it turned out that it was split almost evenly between 46% feeling that they did not have influence, and then 45% feeling that they did have influence. And I thought that was pretty interesting. The neutral category is missing. And when I broke it down by stakeholder group, what I found out was it was the fishermen, again this is red, that were in disagreement because they did to this question regarding whether or not they had influence. And there were some members of the government and institutional group that also didn't feel like they had influence. But for the most part, you see the environmental groups did feel they had influence, and most of the government and institutional folks felt that they had influence. And so throughout the interviews, what I was learning was that there were different reasons why they didn't feel like they had influence. And what I found out was most of it had to do with this role that they felt was restricted because they had so much criteria that they had to use to make these decisions. They didn't feel that there was much latitude given to them. So that was one reason why they didn't have a feeling of influence. Also, the Blue Ribbon Task Force made a lot of decisions in the end that reversed the work that they did, so they felt they didn't have influence for those reasons. The fishermen, most of them felt that the outcome was predetermined, so they felt that they were going to have these MPAs and they were going to have them where they want them, so they didn't have the sense that they could actually influence the outcome on those locations. And the same thing, they didn't feel that the process was open to their local knowledge or input. And this is an interesting point because I heard two times where the fishermen actually hired an outside biologist to produce a different set of data to use in the process, but the MLPA refused any outside data. They'd only use the data that was used for the purpose of the MLPA. And same thing with the tribes. There were 2 tribes that were involved in this process. They actually had their own reports that were provided to the process by their own biologists, and the process would not consider any of that information. And so here are some examples of the comments that came out regarding the sense of having limited influence or some influence and this lack of local knowledge. The local knowledge is kind of an interesting piece because as I said earlier in NPA planning, local knowledge can fill the gap for science, in science and identifying areas that they can protect. But one of the things that I heard from my interviews was that not all fishermen were willing to share those areas because they feared that if they shared or identified the areas of high productivity for fish, that they would lose those areas. So now we move on to the quality of the plan. And I actually have another map if you're interested in looking at it, and a table. So I went to these two maps, but it shows what the final map was. But this table shows the before and after in terms of what they achieved. So they started out with 15 state marine reserves, were the strictest kind. And they had 19 state marine conservation areas, and they had a few marine parks. And the total marine reserves that they had originally before the process started was 42. What they ended up with was they slightly increased the number of MPAs, so it went from 42 to 50, which doesn't seem like a significant amount, but the big thing that they did do here is they actually doubled the area that's protected. So the area, they started out with 7.7% of the area covered as a protected area, and then they actually doubled it to 15%. And so this is pretty significant. So it was less in number, but more in quality. What they also did was they got rid of some of these marine parks. So they went down to 1, and they actually increased the number of reserves from 15 to 28. And then there were 2 military closures that resulted by working with the U.S. Navy in this planning process. So they were willing to close certain areas on the islands, and it actually was almost in their interest because they actually don't like people being around when they have military operations happening. And there were some amendments that did come in 2016, and I'm actually not sure exactly why they did it, but they split the marine conservation areas. These are the blue ones, and the blue ones mean you can fish in a limited manner, and they're specifically regulated by the type of equipment or the type of species. But they split them into no take and take. And my theory on why they did that is because there were some problems from the fishing community that said, well, you can't put a marine protected area in an area we're going to put cables under the water, or you can't make it, if there's a sewage outfall, you can't make that a protected area. So I think what they did was they created these no-take zones, meaning you can't fish, but you can have a sewage outfall there. Or you can't fish, but you can mine for sand. So the idea is that you can impact that area, like humans will need to access it, but it's only fishing that's restricted.
I'm sorry,
Sure.
I know we're not supposed to interrupt, but I've been struggling for the last couple of slides. So the 2016 amendments, when I do the math, there are 52 MPAs, and the new MPAs, there are 50. So if we add 19 plus 21 plus 10 plus 2, that's 52.
Yeah, so there's actually something I'm not showing you here. There's special closures.
So did the coverage change?
That actually, I don't know, because I just captured this information recently, and it didn't spell it out by the coverage. So I only had access to whatever is available publicly. So I would say it probably slightly changed, but probably not a whole lot. It's probably the same amount of coverage, but yeah, there was other category called special closures.
Right, and above, again, if we add 15 plus 19 plus 8, it's not 42.
Oh, what did it come out to be?
So,
let's see. Oh, you're right. So that would be, what, 32? 32.
No.
13 plus 8.
It is 42.
Oh, it is 42,
It is
okay.
42.
Okay, so I did count.
Okay, so, okay, great. So we don't have information on this 2016?
We don't on the breakdown by coverage, which I think would be really interesting. But this is definitely new, and I actually just uncovered this recently.
Okay.
But before these happened, this was the before and after.
Gotcha.
But I thought it was pretty significant that they doubled the size of the area that's protected compared to the different numbers. But the thing I want to point out to you on the map, it's hard to see because there's really little bubbles that are blue and red. The blue means there's limited take. And that created a lot of problems for the environmental community because they really wanted red ones. And they wanted them to be similar to the Channel Islands. They wanted big areas that were red, that offered no fishing whatsoever. And so for them, they thought this plan was a compromise, like a significant compromise, because it doesn't offer the high level of protection that they originally wanted. And one of the things I wanted to do in my project was to find out what the perceptions were among stakeholders about the quality of the plan. And one way to do that is to find out whether they agreed or disagreed with it, because that kind of shows you if the plan is good, they'll agree. If it's not good, they won't agree. And what I found out with this survey was that it was also split between agreement and disagreement, and I don't have the neutral category here. So,
So 7 plus 3 is 10. And 5 plus 3 plus 1 is 9. How can they be the same?
so you're talking about these numbers up here?
Yes.
So 90. So yeah, about 90%. So there's 92%, but then there's an 8% that was in a neutral category.
I understand. I'm just looking at agreed, and I see 5 plus 3 plus 1. So that's 9. And then I see 7 plus 3. That's
So where are you seeing the 5 plus 3 plus 1?
So in government institutions, there's
Oh, so let me tell you a little bit about this. So
okay, because I've been doing percentages and
yeah, there's a reason behind this.
All right.
So let me, I'm happy to share with you. So I had a survey, and the survey, I had 22 respondents. One was missing. So that affected the result from that. And
when you say missing,
so it's missing one representative. So in the survey, and so when I broke it down on the survey, here's also, so I had 23 people total, and so I had one academic, which I moved into the government. So the government group turned into 8. And then I took out the surfer guy that I talked to because he didn't fit one of the 3 categories of fishing, NGO, or government. So the numbers changed when I broke it down by stakeholder group, if that makes any sense.
it makes sense, but
Okay.
my point is that you've been showing these graphs with an N of 21, right? And,
Yeah, so this-
and responses, and the percentages don't correspond to the graphs.
That's correct. Because the percentage, so these percentages are from the whole group as a whole. So when I had, so for instance, so I had 22, so I analyzed it with the surfer in this one. So when I had a sample size of 22, and I took them out when I broke it down by stakeholder group.
So shouldn't you redo the percentages if you took them out of the...
But I did redo them based on the sample size. I adjusted them for the total number of people that I had. So if I had 22 people, the percentages were done based on 22 people here. But on here, I adjusted them based on how many were in each group.
So I think I might be able to help clarify. I understand why your question came up, and I understand your explanation. I think there's just maybe a little bit of a disconnect between the bar graph and the percentages on the bullet point. Is that what you're saying?
It's a complete, I mean, it's...
Yeah, so the bar graph like stands alone, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit during the Q&A, how to revisit maybe how the bullet point is represented.
Right.
But the bar graph is like, I mean, it is what it is. It's just, I think there was this anomalous,
The percentages
participant, we didn't know where to
don't
put
match, the
it.
percentages don't match the
Yeah.
bar graphs.
so
Right.
they just need to be consistent.
Yeah, and I guess what I was trying to do was squeeze in as much information as I could, and I'm definitely open to revisiting that and changing that.
Again, I'm sorry for interrupting, it just keeps...
Yeah, no, I get it, yeah.
Okay, sorry.
So then here are some comments that kind of illustrate how I came to some of my conclusions about perceptions about the quality of the plan. And as you see here, one representative said they agreed to it, but it wasn't ideally what they wanted to see. So they said, was it ideally what I want to see? No, but I think it represents the best attempt at balancing science and social components. There were some folks that did not agree with it at all, and they didn't feel like the decisions were based on sound analysis. And there was a good portion that also said they didn't agree with it or disagree with it. So I grouped them in a category called partially, or partial agreement. So then I'll discuss capacity building, and one of the ways to measure capacity building is the degree to which tools for decision analysis were improved. And this is actually one of the positive things that came out of this project, is that the majority of the respondents thought favorably of a tool called Marine Map, which is a GIS software mapping tool, which helped them make their decisions. And here's an example quote to show how they felt about it, but I had a lot of similar comments. What I also did was I'm gonna wait for them to get back or shake. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So I created these two boxes here to show some of the positives and negatives in terms of capacity building. And as you can see, the process did well in terms of improving decision tools with the GIS mapping software. In fact, that software is being used in other NPA planning efforts now because of that. But one of the things that I thought was interesting that came out, because there was a lot of criticism about the process, 75% of the folks that I interviewed said they were indicated, or that they were interested in participating in future planning processes. And I thought this was a good outcome because it means they're still interested in doing this. They're not completely turned off by public participation work. In addition, one of the positive points was trust actually increased between the environmental groups and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And how I measured that was based on two questions that I had on the survey. One was focused on their attitudes before the process and after the process, their attitudes towards the public agency. And what I found out was the attitudes for the fishing stakeholders actually changed. They had a positive attitude towards the public agency before the process started, and then after the process was complete, the fishing stakeholders had a negative attitude towards the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And similarly with the environmental group, their attitude switched from neutral and negative before the process. It switched to positive after the process was over. And it actually does make a lot of sense that that would happen, because in the past, environmental groups have often criticized agencies for not doing enough. And here's an example where they are doing something, so therefore they did gain their trust. And then in terms of the fishermen, they felt that they lost areas, and they used to like how they were regulated by the fishing game, but now with the new regulations, they're not happy, so therefore they're disappointed with the agency. So those kind of results make sense to me. And then the final part of my plan was focused on what the role of the science was. And if you remember, it was science-based, stakeholder-driven. So there was a high demand for the science criteria. And what I found out was that the results were mixed between the different groups. And so there was some agreement, there was some disagreement, and some partial agreement. And I included some example comments to show you how some people explained that they agreed that it did meet the science criteria, that it didn't agree, and how it partially did. And one of the things that I noticed was that the fishermen, for the most part, felt that the planning process did result in an outcome that reflected the science. And some of them even felt that it went beyond the science, whereas the environmental groups felt that it barely met the scientific requirements because of the decisions and the compromising that was made. And then there were some that said, I think it, for the most part, it does, 75 to 80%. So the next 3 slides are a summary of the focal areas of my project, which was focused on legitimacy of the process, quality of the outcome, and capacity building. So this one is the legitimacy of the process, and how I operationalized it was with these indicators. And these are only a few of them. There's a whole lot more that's part of my research, but these are all I could fit on the slide. And what you see is these colors, so red and green. So red means negative and green means positive. And what I did is, by using the 3 different data sources that I had, so I had document review, I had survey data, and then I had the interview data. And based on the analysis for each indicator, if a group was leaning one way or the other, so for instance, if 50% of the respondents were in agreement, then it would give it a positive green color in the box. And then if it was 50% or more in the negative, then I would give it a negative color. So just to give you an example, so openness and transparency, the fishermen had a big problem with that. They didn't feel it was an open and transparent process. And I found that out through both my survey and my interviews. And so therefore the box is red here. It was the opposite for the environmental community and the government and institutional folks. And so therefore the color-coded green. And so I kind of did this process for each indicator along the way. And one of the trends that you'll notice is that it's more red where the fishing interests are, and it's more green where the environmental interests are. And sometimes I had mixed results. So sometimes, the government institutional would have, half of it, there would be half of the group would be in agreement and half of the group would not be in disagreement. So I created a mixed box right here. And as I discussed earlier, decision making was a problem that kind of showed up in all three groups. So that's why it's red up until this point. But you can see the fishermen did not like the decision making, the environmental groups did not like the decision making, and portion of the government institutional folks were not happy with the decision making. So that's why that is red. There's some areas that you see that are green all the way, which is good. So it kind of shows some of the positives that came out of the process. So the level of commitment was high among all the stakeholders. So there was no doubt about that. So that was green. And then in terms of the tools and information, there was no shortage of information. In fact, that was verified through all my interviews and the survey data. So that's why this is all green. And they actually gave a lot of kudos to that marine map GIS software tools that they had. And the other thing that the process did in terms of, this is why I think they did well in terms of capacity, that they offered training. So when they had these members of the public there to make these maps, they did provide them training on how to use the software. And the software was really good because it actually pulled up different data sources, such as the habitat type, and also they actually had some social economic information regarding fisheries. So they were able to use that information and make those types of decisions. So that's why it did really well in terms of the tools and information. And again, another one that's really red is the reduction of pre-existing conflicts. So this was actually a problem that was throughout the entire process. The conflicts were not reduced because they went into the negotiations with conflict to begin with. And the process was not able to reduce those conflicts at all. And then for quality of the plan, so I operationalized this criteria with these indicators, and then I have a few more that are actually in my research, but these are some of the highlights. And similar process, I coded them red and green based on how the groups were responding. And as you can see, it's a similar trend. The fishing groups expressed dissatisfaction with the quality of the plan. Their perceptions were very negative. And then the environmental groups, for the most part, were very favorable towards the quality of the plan, even though it did not meet the scientific criteria as much as they wanted to. And the results were also mixed within the government institutional folks. There were some that were happy with the plan and some that weren't. And the interesting thing here, the reason why this one is green, because the fishermen thought that it did meet the scientific criteria, but the environmental groups didn't. And the oddity here is even though they felt that it did, they gave it a low rating. In terms of capacity building, I operationalized this with these indicators. And I thought this was actually one of the more positive results that came out because you could see a lot more green on this slide. And the only areas that had a lot of trouble were these two red ones with the fishing community. And the first one is actually kind of an important one because the idea behind public participation also is to have the public become better educated and more informed about the project so they're more likely to produce solutions to those problems. And that didn't happen with the fishing community. And this actually had a lot to do with their perception or the differences in perception. So what I did was I created a table. which I also have a handout if you guys want to look at it, or you can read it on the slide. Makes a difference, but through my interviews, I found out there were different perceptions among these different categories, and which created a lot of problems and why the pre-existing conflicts were never resolved. So in terms of definition of the problem, the fishermen for the most part did not feel that there was a problem. They felt that they were already managed, and they were managed well, and they were managed at maximum sustainable yield. On the other hand, the environmental NGO stakeholders felt that the resources were not being managed well, and they actually thought the marine life is in a really degraded state, and they needed to do something about it, and they thought MPAs were the solution. And the cause of the problem, so there's two ways of looking at it. So the environmental groups really, in many ways, kind of singled out fishermen because of one of the human activities that do affect marine life. But if you talk to a fisherman, they think differently. They think about, well, what about the other problems? There's water pollution going on, there's climate change, there's oil and gas development that's happening, there's dredging. I mean, so they see it very differently in terms of what the cause of the marine degradation is. And then in terms of the solution to the problem, the fishermen, they like how they're being managed by Department of Fish and Wildlife with bag size and limits, and by license. The environmental groups prefer to have areas that were prohibited fishing completely. So there's a whole, different ideology between what the problem was and how to solve it. And then the philosophy is very different. So it's very common to use MPAs in fisheries, but they use them very differently than they do for biodiversity protection. So I included those two differences there as well. And then one of the things that did come out of my interviews that I thought was important to highlight here, and it wasn't a question that I asked any of my interviewees, it was something that just naturally developed, was that they kind of informed me in what condition would they accept an MPA, or what would make it more acceptable for them. And they said they were really supportive of a true wilderness model where all human access is restricted, not just them. And I thought that was kind of interesting because I don't think NPA managers or a lot of these agencies kind of think of it that way. So now I'll move into my conclusion. And so what I decided was that it was a partial success based on my perceptions. And I meant partial because for the environmental community and some of the government folks, they actually supported the plan. They thought it was legitimate. But for the fishermen, they did not support the plan or were dissatisfied, and they actually thought it was not legitimate. But it was also successful, though, in terms of capacity building, because some of the fishermen even expressed interest in future participation in activities. And the process did well in terms of the tools and technology and the information availability. What I did find was that the results of my study is actually consistent with other NPA studies that have been done elsewhere. So it is very common to have this type of opposition. And it also is very common to have, when you have different stakeholders such as fishermen involved, that the plan that you end up with is a little bit watered down in terms of the protection level. So that is something that is consistent with the other research that's been out there. One of the problems, because the fishermen are not on board with it, so there are issues with poaching that is happening, and that's also consistent with other research studies that have come out. In the public participation literature, they actually paint a very different picture, whereas they see more intense processes where the stakeholders are involved in decision making. They feel that most often it yields better quality outcomes. And I feel that my study actually kind of contradicts that. But more importantly, it's just saying that having an intense process is not necessarily a sufficient condition alone to make the quality of the outcome high. And so I came up with a few ideas for some recommendations for future research. And I thought the first one was an interesting one because, is this your last one? Yeah. Okay. So I thought this first recommendation was interesting because it actually came up through one of my interviews when I was talking to a conservation organization. They were saying that they were unhappy that the marine protected areas that they did get were more blue and multi-use and limited take, and they actually said, well, there's not enough research that's been done on that. They're not proven. These marine reserves are. So here's what I think. I think that if they actually do more studies on the multi-use blue that allow limited take, these type of MPAs, if the research can show that they do have biological effects that are really good and allow for some recreational fishing, I think if there's enough evidence there, it could actually be a tool that would be more promoted than the red no-take marine reserves. It could also go both ways. So they do research on this type of MPA and they find out that there's not a lot of biological success, then they probably won't promote the use of it. But
Only 1 minute.
Oh, 1 minute?
Yeah.
Okay. I guess the two other things that I'd be recommend is more research focused on capacity, the relationship between capacity in terms of participating in the process and capacity to manage it. And the reason why I say that is because they do have a program right now called NPA Collaboratives that is part of the MLPA. But interestingly enough, there are no fishermen involved in it whatsoever. So I think that would be an area of future study. And then I'll go to the last 2 bullet points real quick regarding something, I guess, relative to my study, is I think there should be more studies done on how to resolve these type of conflicts before they go into negotiations, and as well as how to engage stakeholders more meaningful in a process, especially where you're restricting access. So that's my conclusion.
Great. Thank you. So Dr. Gershenson has a hard stop at 2:30, so I really wanted to make sure that we got comments in from the committee members first, and I'll record that for you. David, do you want to start us off?
Just comments or questions or both?
Either.
Okay. Well, I have a whole bunch, but I'll just pick a couple. I was curious, so the public participation literature that you looked at, was that also, I don't remember, was that specifically focused on scientific processes?
Mostly environmental decision making. So I looked at a lot of meta studies. So it's interesting. So they do like 200 studies. And they say 30% of it was focused on natural resource protection, and like another one would be focused on like siting and permitting projects to do more pollution. So they divided it into different things. So, but it all was in the realm of environmental decision making.
And I was also just really curious about, in terms of the finding that most of the folks in your study felt that in the area of capacity building, that there was a lot of positive results, and that they, even though they had a lot of concerns about the process and the outcomes, that they would in fact participate again. I'm just curious what further comment you would make on that, and whether you think it's worth it to do these processes, albeit flawed in all these ways,
highly
and the outcomes might be quite imperfect. Like, is it worth it just for the purpose of capacity building and future participation?
Yeah, I actually do think so. So I think it's really encouraging, because I thought that was one of the more, I actually expected, especially the fishermen, to say they were no longer interested in doing this, and especially for the people who participated for the first time, because they even admitted that they were naive in terms of how these processes work. So I was actually really surprised with the results. They indicated they were interested in doing this again. And to me, that reflects that they do see an importance of this. And I think, especially for some of the newer folks, they did become better learned or schooled and a little bit more savvy now. So the next time they do something with a different subject, they'll have a lot more tools to choose from. So in terms of do I think I should do this, yeah, I do see room to do it. However, my personal opinion, I feel that the scientific bar is really high. This is my personal opinion. I'm not sure the degree of public involvement should be that high, because if it's going to undermine the science goals. But in a process like this, I think even though that the scientific goals weren't necessarily met, I do think it reflects compromise, and it does reflect the fact that the state did work with the people to try to incorporate their preferences. And even though they're not happy, I mean, the fishermen are not even happy with those compromises that they did get, and that's common in research. But I think it does show that they put effort into trying to incorporate their preferences and their values. So to that degree, I think those processes do work. But I do think this idea of the pre-existing conflicts, I think would be better to try to resolve those before you go into negotiations.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of another question I
Yeah.
had, was about those pre-existing conflicts and whether a process like this could be expected to address those, or if this is something we need to really
Yeah,
figure out going in.
now there's a whole nother set of research out there on NPA planning focused on community management. And I think, so for the environmental groups, they kind of wanted to do that here because the management is now going to depend on them and the involvement of the community, but it didn't happen that effectively here. But there's cases elsewhere around the world where there have been fishermen who said, hey, you know, we fish here every day and it's not looking so good. We actually need to do something about this. And so they come up with the idea themselves, and then they'll go to the agency and say, hey, this looks really bad. Or maybe the commercial fishermen are fishing so much that there's not enough left for recreational fishing. So sometimes these communities can actually do something themselves, and that way they're on the same page with some of the environmental community folks.
Yeah, in that regard, something that would be good to see a little bit more in your conclusion about is bringing back this idea of the incongruence of like the MPA, the scientific standards related to that, and then the way fishing is managed.
Yeah.
Because I remember in reading through that was definitely at odds, or not incorporated at all.
It actually isn't. So one of the complaints that came out through interviews was that the fishermen, they thought that the regulations by Department of Fish and Game were being criticized, but they thought they should have been reevaluated. And they weren't reevaluated. Instead, they decided to do this complementary approach of marine protected areas. But I think there should have been a look at, well, are these regulations even working? And if not, you know, what could we do to change them? And they didn't even do that.
Seems like inextricably what they're trying to do.
Right.
Good questions. Maybe we can move to Alex for 4 minutes.
Sure. So, question number one. In our discussions, I know that there were other stakeholders that didn't even want to talk to you because they were so upset at the process.
Yes.
And you didn't really mention them.
Oh, I wanted to, and I didn't get a chance because I was
Right.
rushing through them. Can I tell you who they are?
Sure.
So abalone farms. Abalone farming, they got hit really hard as a result of this process, especially up in the Santa Barbara region. And they have long-term leases, as you know, and I don't know if their leases were up, but they actually require them to move. And for them, they felt that they did participate in good faith, and they really hoped that there would be a reasonable outcome that would come out of this, but for them it didn't. And so therefore, they just didn't want to waste any more time talking about the
Right.
process.
But it was also the native groups.
Sure. So the tribes and yeah.
Subsistence fishing.
My point is that, so you show the folks, so this is N of 21 out of 64, right? And you basically said, oh, well, I couldn't talk to the other ones. But really, some of them you couldn't talk to because you couldn't find them, and that's totally legitimate because it's been a long time. And some of them you couldn't talk to because they said the whole process was such bunk that I don't even want to talk about, right? So, you know, separating those two groups would potentially drive a very, very different conclusion.
It could, and I didn't know. I didn't feel like I include them in my sample unless I.
No, but at least, I mean, at least say, and by the way, there were another 15 people that were that felt that the whole process was so broken. So then in comparison, and especially if we figure out this problem with percentages that I still massively have, because you either have a sample size of 21 or 22, and it can't be both, right? But really, it's not even. And every time that I redid percentages based on what I saw, it was, you know, a minimum of 5% more negative than positive on each point, right? So that's
Okay.
first point. And the reality is that there were far more stakeholders, and I don't know how many people basically told you, hey, thanks for contacting me, I'm not talking about it because it was so terrible. Right, and that would be a nice number to know.
Okay.
And the second part is, so after hearing all of this about the Blue Ribbon Task Force, did you reach out to the members of the Blue Ribbon Task Force to find out, well, why did you mix up the maps?
Yeah, and I didn't, but there was a survey that was done after the process was over by a group called Crimson West. So they do a lot of facilitation, and so they actually did a kind of like a post-mortem after the process was over to find out how stakeholders felt, but then they also met with the Blue Ribbon Task Force, and I included some information from that report, but basically they said they had to pick and choose because they wanted to satisfy the other folks as well, and they said it was really hard for them to meet the scientific criteria without resulting in huge impacts to the social economics part.
So when you say the other folks, you mean?
The Blue Ribbon Task Force.
No. So, but when the Blue Ribbon Task Force picked and chose from the three maps.
And there were 3 different groups at that point.
Right, so, which was not originally part of the process. What was their motivation for changing the process?
Oh, and that is actually an interesting question. So no, I didn't reach out to them, I didn't interview them because I thought it was outside the scope, and I think it's a great thing to do next. But, what was it that I was going to say? So one of the things that came out of the interviews was that there was a sense from the stakeholders that some of those decisions were driven by politics. Because they had closed door meetings, for example, so they thought that there was a lot of backroom deals that were being made between the BRTF and other groups. But this is all from the interview data, and I don't know if I went into an interview with the Blue Ribbon Task Force member if they would tell me that so explicitly, but I think it's definitely worth investigating.
For sure. Great.
So I always have questions for you, but I will hold my questions. And we've talked about a lot of them in the previous several weeks. So what I'm going to do is actually, maybe we'll do a separate meeting outside. And Billy and Emily, if you have questions, you can talk to Nicole. This is a hard stop. Sorry about this. I know you have a priority. Are you like actually having to be at that meeting at 2:30?
I have to get in the car.
Oh, okay.
Over the hill because I have a child.
Oh, didn't clap? Did we clap? Oh, sorry.
Oh, you don't have to.